Everyone. This is update for June 13, 2022, day 110 of the war, end of the date update. So today we're going to talk a little bit about economy, energy policy, price of crude oil, fertilizers, food, and because they all interrelated. It's one whole system, and we should not look at this from reductionist approach. And then we're gonna do walks through the front line. So let's first a little bit describe what's going on in Ukrainian economy. So there was a news today that Ukrainian electricity consumption in industry fell by 60%. So this is excellent indicator or proxy for GDP, right? So it really kind of tells us that Ukrainian GDP really about 40% of what used to be before the war, right? So this kind of just confirms what we were saying before, that Ukrainian economy is essentially finished at this point. And the situation in Ukraine probably will get worse, and it's the difficulty of economic situation is going to be magnified by completely misguided actions of Ukrainian government, which makes things much worse than otherwise they would have been. So this is a sort of sorry state of affairs in Ukrainian economy. Now let's look at what's going on in the Russian economy. So there was interesting piece of information from Russia. Russia has 85 regions, just for those, most people don't, not aware of that, but just so everybody knows, because it's going to be relevant for the statistics. So in February of this year, 72 Russian regions were showing positive economic growth out of 85, as we said. Then in March, it dropped to 55. In April, it dropped to 27. In May, we don't have information, but it's probably even less than that. So essentially, as we can see, and that really means that, it's not like the rest of them dropped to zero. It means that many of them are showing negative economic growth. Well, you cannot say it's growth. Basically, the GDP of those regions is going down. So this really says to us that Russian economy is on downward trend, but much sort of slower downward trend relative to Ukrainian economy. Ukrainian economy is just literally nosediving and pretty fast. So this is important because, as we discussed many times, that the economy is the basis for the war, right? You have no economy, you cannot wage a war. So that's one sort of. This kind of shows us where both countries stand economy-wise. The only saving grace for Ukraine is that it receives some support, financial support, for Ukrainian government, for Ukrainian military, and so on. So that allows Ukraine to continue fighting. At the same time, everything is extremely stretched in Ukraine. So now let's actually look at what's going on with their energy policy and what is West trying to do by blocking Russian oil from the market. What this really leads to is it leads to extremely high inflation everywhere in the world. I'm sure wherever you are right now, you're seeing extremely high prices for gasoline, diesel fuel, in any place where you live around the world. This is obviously not because this embargo on Russian oil. The things were set in motion prior to that. However, again, this economic policy makes things much worse, right? And it may lead to extremely difficult economic situation in the West, which you probably have seen a preview today. And on Friday, what's going on in the stock market, because it's to extent indicator where the economy is going, and especially interest rates in the US. You probably have seen what's going on there. The mortgage rates are pushing 6%, and that really means that the housing crash is probably around the corner in the US. So this and what is so basically there is a dilemma that's facing the West. Is one is the way you can deal with inflation are two options, right? One option is you increase supply of the resources, which includes crude oil, and crude oil, you know, is essential for economy, for GDP, right? You don't have, because behind every single unit of GDP you have unit of energy. If your energy becomes more expensive, your GDP is falling, or you have fewer units of energy, then your economy is falling. So this is reflected as inflation. We see it as inflation, right? So if you have less sort of supply, the only way to positive way to address this problem is to increase supply of oil, of any energy resources you can, like, and specifically cheaper ones, right? Because that's what our world is built, our economy in this world is built around cheap sources of energy, right? Otherwise we would be living in medieval ages or 19th century or early 20th century, essentially, if things change. so this is one approach, right? And that really means to changing attitudes towards oil and natural gas extraction in the West, and specifically in US and Canada, right? Increasing production there is the only true source of solving this problem. So this is kind of like a positive way to solve the problem. The negative way to solve this problem of what we're seeing as which manifests itself as inflation is by killing off demand for consumer goods, right? So you don't have demand, then prices for resources may or may not fall. And this is another problem that and this is done by increasing interest rates, right? Because interest rates, they drive everything in the economy. They drive even stock market, because all of this, stocks that you're seeing going down are going down because of the rising interest rate. And so the problem with this approach that you really need to increase interest rates pretty high to kill off demand, and you're gonna kill off a lot of this demand. That's gonna be extremely painful, borderline depression like situation in the West, in order to bring prices of the resources, which is what Russia has, to the lower level, right? So, for example, even on the news that interest rate, the interest rates are gonna go up, right? The interest rate showed up today. If you can see, there are few key commodities, they didn't go down much. Like crude oil stayed essentially the same. So, and then also agriculture, food, right? The grains essentially stayed the same, didn't move much. Everything rest just got crushed, went down in flames totally. So this means that, like, even this increased in interest rate level of interest rates is still not enough to destroy enough demand to bring price of crude oil and food down. And this is already going to be very painful. We're kind of like forward looking right now, right? The pain will come to the average sort of consumer, average person, probably in 2 weeks, 1 month up to 2 months. But the problem is, even this does not sort of solve the problem. You need to increase rates even more, which really gonna crash the economy everywhere. So, and how this gonna affect this is gonna be totally sort of counterproductive to Ukraine's ability to continue this war, because if things are really bad in the West, the ability to support Ukraine goes really down, and that's a big sort of challenge and the problem. It's in a way self-defeating. So what really, in a nutshell, is happening is that Russia is being able to deflect to great extent negative economic effect back towards West, right? So they basically, like a boomerang, right? It hits Russia and then goes back to the West and hurts West probably more than the Russia. Russia is clearly, in difficult situation. The economy is going down, so it's, in a way, it's a question which economy will go down first at this point, which is not how you kind of ideally would like to sort of wage a war, or how you would like to win a war, right? You kind of want to drain resources of your enemy and kind of keep your resources in good shape, or even growing those, right? So this is kind of big problem, and we need to pay attention, and we're sure that this will draw attention of our viewers, and they will be facing those problems in their lives. Then related to this problem is food, right? Because it's also driver of inflation. So Ukrainian government released some data today that they expect that Ukraine will harvest about 50 to 55 million tons of grains, which we think is a little bit too optimistic. We're not saying it's going to be much lower, but it's probably going to be more in 45 million range, which kind of Ukraine needs for its own consumption about 20. So this really means that there are 25 million tons of grain available for export to the world. And this is what we are sort of expecting and kind of projecting probably about months ago. And this, as we mentioned then, is about half of what Ukraine used to be exporting. And this is the sort of positive part, that you can really export the way sort of the outlets that Ukraine right now has for export, which is 2 million tons per month, essentially allows to export all of this 25 or maybe 27 million tons out of Ukraine over the course of the year, because 12 by 2 is 24, maybe there is a little bit more capacity over time. So Ukraine can export fully this extra that it has, even with its seaports being blocked, because basically the exports are happening mostly through Romania. So the Ukrainian, and then also basically Ukrainian grains are being brought here to Danube River, which is on the border with Romania, and from there they're being picked up by the ships. Also, there is some percentage goes through Poland, but this is much more expensive route and less sort of it actually reduces incentive in Ukraine to produce, because the margin then goes down significantly for Ukrainian farmers. So this is much more preferable through the Romanian route. And so, as you can see, this is also kind of tells like, okay, Ukraine is not going to produce more in terms of agriculture output. So again, this constraint, this supply side that we discussed before, which drives this, at this point, this inflation situation. So hopefully this kind of helps. And there is another important data point, that Libya, which produces 1.1 million barrels per day of crude oil, stopped production, right? Which is very interesting. And also, we're not saying anything, but it's also very interesting that Wagner mercenaries were fighting there in Libya, and now what Libyan government or Libya does as a country really helps to support high prices for crude oil, which helps Russia, right? Because if they don't, the let's say the export falls down in terms of physical, quantity side, the price goes up, and it more than compensates for the fall in the quantity side, right? So the price time quantity, it's your revenue, right? So quantity goes down, price goes up much more, your revenue is still the same or even higher, right? So that's a problem. overall. Now let's actually go to the now let's look at the front line, and we're gonna start in a clockwise fashion as we always do, and we're gonna start from the very north. So the very north is basically exchange of artillery and mortar fire. No changes here. Situation more or less sort of stable in this way. Now let's look at the situation straight east of Kharkiv. There are some changes there. So Russian troops managed to push Ukrainian forces a little bit sort of away from the state border and created a little bit of a buffer in this area here, this kind of corner. This is especially was important for them because they need to protect, first of all, Shebekino, this small town, which is a large logistical hub for supply of Russian troops that are fighting in Ukraine, and also Vovchansk, which is kind of like almost there. And it's also, you know, it would be very painful for Russian troops if Ukrainian side captures Vovchansk, because then it's a sort of throwing a stone and use Shebekino. And this essentially, if Ukrainian artillery can easily shell and attack Shebekino, this would create a lot, kind of chaos in Russian supply, on the logistical side of Russian troops. So anyway, so they Russian troops managed to push Ukrainian toward a little bit more towards south. And let's actually look a little bit more in detail at how the front line is. So this is the Vovchansk, right? The Shebekino is, we don't see it on the map. This is the state border here. What Russian troops did, they essentially captured village Starytsya, Izbytske, Varvarivka, and Ternova. So, and then Ukrainian troops essentially slightly north of Rubizhne and literally like straight south of Ternova. That's their positions. And this is like this large forest is essentially no man's land here. And again, there is no continuous front line. It's all centered around strongholds. So what this really means, there's always a lot of reconnaissance action by both sides. You know, small company, you know, not company, the platoon and squad sizes groups there are always skirmishes in this area, and there's always attempts to capture this village or that village. So that's essentially what's going on. But this is not like, we just want to make it clear, this is not large scale attack or anything like that. This is still fighting with the, you know, at most company size units. That's all it is here. There's nothing, this is not a major scale attack here. Now let's move to Izyum bridgehead, which is here as always. Let's look there. This is high level overview, kind of schematic view. This is the main Russian units that are on bridgehead. And these units are acting more as consolidated units or battle groups here. This is Ukrainian units here. So what? Let's sort of go back a little bit. So yesterday, day before yesterday, Russian troops managed to make some progress here, and they were stopped here at village in front of villages of Krasnopilya and Dolina. Then Russian troops really managed to capture Bogorodychne and kind of were stopped south of it. So today Ukrainian troops managed to push back a little bit, sort of kind of small scale counterattack, and the fighting is right now inside of Bogorodychne. So basically this village has been kind of disputed at this point. Russian troops did not manage to establish any of the three bridgeheads that they tried to do in the other days. We said we don't have confirmation what's going on there. So none of these places were captured by Russian troops. They did make attempts, but so far Ukrainian defenses are still there. So this is the rest of the situation here is on the Izyum bridgehead is stable, and there are no changes otherwise. Now let's keep going. Let's look what's going on at Severodonetsk salient, which is where the main fighting right now going on. So northern shoulder is always quiet. Then there is obviously fighting in Severodonetsk, and as we discussed yesterday, the last remaining bridge was destroyed by Russian artillery. So now it's extremely difficult to resupply Ukrainian troops. We're not sure for how long that that will be possible without incurring extremely high losses, because at some point, maybe not the right way to say it, but the cost benefit analysis may say, okay, it's prohibitively expensive in terms of human lives to maintain this bridgehead, because this is really essentially Ukrainian bridgehead on the eastern side of the Severodonetsk River. The only sort of plus and why it works, because then Ukrainian artillery helps and supports Ukrainian defenders by essentially creating, we couldn't say it firewall, but strong artillery barrage here that prevents successful Russian attacks and attempts to totally destroy this bridgehead. So this is dynamic situation. Which way it will fall is unclear, and we'll just need to watch. From a general kind of like big picture view, this bridgehead does not have any strategic importance essentially. If anything, this bridgehead only helps to drain Russian resources, which in futile attack, because if you have strong artillery support, the attacking troops will have heavy losses, right? So, and also drains Russian resources and keeps Russian resources here, instead of, like, let's say, reallocating them here for the final kind of blow to Ukrainian army, final penetration that would allow to basically complete encirclement of this Ukrainian troops here. So from that perspective, maybe it has some role. In any case, all of this Second Army Corps brigades are in very, very sorry state of affairs. We believe we have some information for the, let's say, 4th Brigade, and based on information from the Russian sources, by the way. So we're not using any Ukrainian sources for this because they're not reliable. So based on the Russian sources, the strength of the 4th Brigade is 50%, right? What this really means is that it's essentially, as we discussed before, if you look at the, whatever unit, brigade, doesn't matter, division, essentially half of it is some kind of support for the other half that actually does the fighting, right? And maybe you don't need half of it, but due to inefficiencies in the Soviet army, which, as we said many times, Ukrainian army and Russian army are basically their sort of, I would say, grandchildren or children of that army. And so essentially what it means that if you don't have half of it, that it really means that the most of the losses obviously in that fighting half of it. So that means your fighting half is essentially close to nothing. And this unit, in sort of normal conditions, this unit is not even able to carry on defensive operations. But nevertheless, there are sort of new conscripts, like it's like a churn machine, right? New conscripts have been constantly sort of thrown into it without too much training, and then it's thrown into the battlefield. So that's kind of how it works. And so basically what this really means that these units are not worth much, and they also they are pretty poorly equipped, especially relative to the regular Russian army. But nevertheless, that still forces Russian command to keep them here, and they cannot throw them for whatever other action that they could use here. So so let's just look at the Severodonetsk here. Again, essentially their front line is going somewhere at this chemical complex. We don't know where it is, and to be fair, probably nobody knows for sure, because the fighting is very sporadic, and even commanders may not have a clear picture of where the front line is, because it's all kind of broken down into small groups. You not always have information from them. So basically, it's kind of like a total chaos, essentially. Like where every small groups fights on its own, and they may not be perfectly connected with other groups. So that's kind of the picture there. Then let's look what's going on here around Popasna, because that's really the most important part of this whole situation. So the Russian troops had again put heavy pressure on Ukrainian defenders here in Berestove, Bilohorivka, Mykolaiivka, and especially Rubivka. So Rubivka was attacked from kind of two directions. Let's actually go and look at this. So this is a Rubivka here. So there was attack from, kind of like from, which is southwestern direction from Viktorivka, and then from kind of like some, well, eastern or southeastern from this station that was recently captured by Russian troops from this area. Ukrainian defenses held, but this is very clear that Russian command realizes that this is kind of like a important domino in Ukrainian defense, this village Rubivka, that if you kind of pull this domino out of Ukrainian defenses, then the other dominoes, specifically here in this area, will fall. Because if Russian troops, let's say, kind of gain this area, then this is the supplying, especially here at the bottom of this salient, becomes extremely difficult, and it will cost a lot of lives. So Ukrainian command will be kind of forced to pull out of this area. And this is relatively good defensive positions for Ukrainian army here. So it would be, bad idea to lose them. So Ukrainian army basically holds on, and as long as this Rubivka is in Ukrainian hands, chances of any kind of encirclement or anything here are close to zero. And obviously Russian command realizes that. At the same time, they're still trying to push in this kind of more like straight northern direction, because if we go, let's go back here, this is this northern direction. If they go straight north, then they really can kill sort of many birds with one shot, right? Because they're not only encircling Ukrainian troops here in this Zlote and Hirske area, but they can essentially, encircle everything here, or force disorderly withdrawal from all of this area, which we said many times this will lead to loss of all of the heavy equipment, essentially everything, and also still heavy losses, human losses, mostly as prisoners of war. May not be so many killed, but essentially not everybody will make out through the sort of this bottleneck here, and a lot of Ukrainian soldiers will surrender and obviously become prisoners of war. So this will even technically, Ukrainian troops may not be sort of encircled, but effectively what this really means, heavy defeat, very similar to encirclement, right? So for that reason, because it's going to be very hard for Ukrainian army to withdraw in orderly fashion due to like poor training, poor command, like poor communication system. So all of that is making it super difficult for Ukrainian army to successfully maneuver on the battlefield, and especially retreating, which is one of the most difficult maneuvers in the military in general, regardless of your skill level. Like, even for skilled units, it's extremely hard. So now let's look a little bit more at their sort of southern section of this Popasna salient. So there are no major changes here. Russian troops continue to attempts to exploit their initial success here around Dolomitne. So as we discussed, they tried to attack here to basically encircle Ukrainian troops in this tiny area, but there were no success. They also attacked towards Kadema. So they're trying to kind of testing Ukrainian defenses in all directions and see where there is a weakness, and then probably they would like to, they would try to exploit that weakness essentially. But so far, no successes today. Let's keep going. Let's see what's going on straight west of Donetsk. Here, pretty much everything is more or less quiet. There are still relatively weak attacks towards New York. We don't really even have good explanation why Russian troops really trying to, to capture it. It doesn't really change the whole situation at all. Nevertheless, there are this non-stop attacks of it. There's also, we mentioned this before about a week ago, so there's heavy shelling, artillery shelling of Donetsk, of basically residential area here. And what we think is this is in preparation for something kind of big, like from a political perspective, right? Either like a formal declaration of war on Ukraine as a result of killing citizens here. Well, we're not saying that Ukraine is killing, but what we mean is allegations, right? So this is kind of like what is important, like, oh, you just allegations kind of is good enough for this whole situation, right? And so this is in preparation for something big and something political here. We don't know. We'll find out in a sort of due course what it is, but there's something is being prepared. That's all we can say right now. Otherwise, there are no changes in the front line here at all. This is just a closer look at this Avdiivka area, which was the main where the sort of main direction of Russian attack, and where the next sort of immediate objective for Russian troops here. And this is New York here. Now let's look at what's going on at the Zaporizhia front line. Here's pretty much essentially everything is kind of quiet and dead in terms of no like attacks, right? But there is artillery shelling non-stop on both sides here. Basically, both sides are digging in preparing, defensive positions. And this is the bigger picture of this whole Zaporizhia front line. No changes here. And as we mentioned before, there is no continuous front line here. It's all because there's not enough troops on both sides. So you have basically fighting around the strongholds. Now let's move to the to Kherson bridgehead. Situation here is essentially the same as in Zaporizhia, right? After a Ukrainian attempt to attack, the whole fighting died off because both sides could not achieve their objectives, and at this point it's all positional defensive, exchange of artillery fire, and digging in and preparing for defensive action on both sides. So exactly as we said, this is similar to the Zaporizhia front line, and essentially, and the same situation here. There's no continuous front line, especially starting from this area north of Snigirivka, all of this area, there's no continuous front line. Here, because it's a relatively short distance, it's sort of close to continuous front line. Not perfectly, but it's at least kind of like close enough. But starting from somewhere from here, it's all just fighting along the strongholds. And this is very similar. The geography here and the way of fighting and the number of troops is very similar to the Zaporizhia front line. In many ways, they are very similar sort of theater of operations and how the whole fighting is going on. Okay, that's it for today. Thanks for watching, and until tomorrow. Bye-bye.